Good morning. It's always great to be back in the church where I'm a member. I'm not a great church member because I'm not here very often. I currently serving as the interim at Quail Springs in Oklahoma City, and that's conditioned me. They have 3 services on Sunday morning, so I feel like I'm up used to it at least. I've been doing it now since September. And so it's good to be back here. This is one reason why I can be home, and my family, I'll be with them this morning. And so so many of you are my friends, and so many of you, I've known you for years, and I work with you at OBU, or I've just known you here in Shawnee. And so it's great to be here. It's Joshua this year. The winter Bible study, January Bible study, technically, that Southern Baptists do. I don't pick the book. Lifeway does. And so it goes 2 New Testament, 1 Old Testament. And this is the 3rd year, and this is the Old Testament year. We did Ephesians 2 years ago. We did the Sermon on the Mount last year. Feels like last week. Last year, and this year it's Joshua. And then next year it goes back to New Testament. And it really shocks me how a day or days can seem so long and years can seem so short. Sometimes it feels like a day's never going to end, and now I stand here thinking about it's been a year since we did Sermon on the Mount, and it's hard for me to believe. But it's Joshua this year, and Joshua chapter 1 is where we're going to begin this morning. Tonight, there's a handout that I'll have for you. We'll do a little bit of introduction to Joshua, and 24 chapters, and you're thinking 24 chapters, like 4 or 5 sessions, how are you going to do that? Well, the good news is once you get to chapter 12 in Joshua, basically it's just allotment of the land until you get to the very last couple of chapters. So we don't really have to cover 24 chapters in much detail. So we'll put a lot of weight on the early part through the first 12 chapters and then get to the conclusion. But this morning it's Joshua chapter 1, and I want to talk about facing the future. I guess for us it's a new year, facing the new year. Without fear. And the text is Joshua 1 through 18. One of the most famous lines from Shakespeare comes from Julius Caesar, Act 2, where Caesar says, "Cowards die many times before their deaths. The valiant never taste of death but once." It speaks to the paralyzing power of fear. I can be afraid of death, or I can be afraid of failure every moment of my life, and in doing so, I'm experiencing death and failure in some sense every day of my life, again and again. Research shows that every time we linger over thoughts of death, failure, or experiencing suffering, our bodies suffer to some degree the trauma of those events. It's the presence of fear in our lives that leads to Joshua chapter 1 verse 9 being one of the most popular verses in the whole Bible. You might recognize it, Joshua 1:9. "Now I have commanded you, be strong and be courageous. Do not be afraid and do not be discouraged, for I, the Lord your God, am with you wherever you go." There are 31,102 verses in the Bible. Of those 31,102, Joshua 1:9 always shows up as one of the most popular verses in the whole Bible. In fact, you can Google these things, YouVersion.com, which is one of the places where people would search for a Bible verse if they were just trying to look one up. In last year, 2024, in their most engaged top 10 verses of 2024, Joshua 1:9 was one of those. It was number 4. Joshua 1:9 was number 4 in the United Kingdom with 18,000 monthly searches. This Joshua 1:9 is number 1 in Brazil, Croatia, Hungary, Korea, and Tanzania. The number 1 verse looked up in all of those countries. Obviously, fear is something we deal with, and it's not just it's global, it's universal fear. Sometimes our fear is unwarranted. Some people get overcome with fear of flying on a beautiful day in a reliable plane with an experienced pilot. And you might be on that flight and everything's beautiful and still just be inside, filled with anxiety. But what if that plane runs into a thunderstorm and the plane begins to wobble and the oxygen mask falls out of the overhead portion, and you notice that the flight attendants are looking very nervous and sitting down and putting on their belt? Now, anybody should be afraid in that moment. You should be feeling some anxiety in that moment. That's not really what I'm talking about. In fact, anxiety in those moments can be actually good. It can get your adrenaline pumping. Sometimes you act maybe with a clearer mind, and you can act actually better with that a little bit of fear. But I'm talking about more the kind of fear and anxiety that is more a part of our imagination, the kind of fear and anxiety that can be paralyzing for us. That kind of fear has its own judgment. Even if the thing we're fearful of and have anxiety about never occurs, we still suffer because of that fear and anxiety. When we open up the book of Joshua, we find ourselves in the middle of a story. It's not really a beginning in Joshua 1:1. It's the middle of a story, and it's a story that actually goes back to Genesis chapter 12 when God calls Abraham. You remember when God calls Abraham, He tells him to leave his home, to leave his extended family, to just take his immediate family. He's leaving everything behind. He's going to go to a land that God's going to show him, and God makes certain promises to him. I'm going to make your descendants great. I'm going to give you a great name. I'm going to protect you. No nation will be able to come against you. And maybe most significant in all of that is, I'm going to give you a land that I will show you, and your descendants will live in that land. Now that's Genesis 12. When we get to Joshua chapter 1, they're still not in that land. And a lot has transpired since God called Abraham, including 400 years of slavery in Egypt. And it's Moses who brings them up out of that slavery. And then you think, okay, now, finally, 400 plus years after the promise to Abraham, they're finally getting to go into the land. But no, they spend a year at Mount Sinai. Then they send out the spies, and they're ready to cross the wilderness and cross the Jordan and go into the promised land. And you might remember what happens there when they send out the spies in Numbers 13. There are 12 spies, 10 of them come back and say, there's no chance. They were filled with fear and anxiety about giants in the land, and only 2, Joshua and Caleb, say, we can do it. But because of the majority vote, they didn't go in immediately, and because of that, they wander in the wilderness for 40 years, led by Moses. Well, that period's over. All that generation has died, and now they're parked on the banks of the Jordan River, and across that raging river this time of the year, it's overflowing its banks. Across that river is the promised land that God had given them. But they've not yet taken possession of it. And that's where we find ourselves in Joshua 1:1. After the death of Moses, the Lord's servant, the Lord spoke to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' assistant. Moses, my servant, is dead. Now you and all the people prepare to cross over the Jordan to the land I'm giving the Israelites. I have given you every place where the sole of your foot treads, just as I promised Moses. Your territory will be from the wilderness and Lebanon to the great river, the Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites, and west to the Mediterranean Sea. No one will be able to stand against you as long as you live. I will be with you, just as I was with Moses. I will not leave you or abandon you. Be strong and courageous, for you will distribute the land I swore to their ancestors to give them as an inheritance. Above all, be strong and very courageous to observe carefully the whole instruction my servant Moses commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right or the left, so that you will have success wherever you go. This book of instruction must not depart from your mouth. You are to meditate on it day and night, so that you may carefully observe everything written in it. For then you will prosper and succeed in whatever you do. Haven't I commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. You might notice that's 3 times. Be strong and courageous. Verse 6, 7, and 9. And verse 10. Then Joshua commanded the officers of the people, go through the camp and tell the people, get provisions ready for yourselves, for within 3 days you will be crossing the Jordan to go in and take possession of the land the Lord your God is giving you to inherit. And Joshua said to the Reubenites, the Gadites, and half the tribe of Manasseh, remember what Moses, the Lord's servant, commanded you when he said, the Lord your God will give you rest, and he will give you this land. Your wives, dependents, and livestock may remain in the land Moses gave you on this side of the Jordan, that is the east side of the Jordan. But your best soldiers must cross over in battle formation ahead of your brothers and help them until the Lord gives your brothers rest, as he has given you, and they too possess the land the Lord your God is giving them. You may then return to the land of your inheritance and take possession of what Moses, the Lord's servant, gave you on the east side of the Jordan. They answered Joshua, everything you have commanded us we will do, and everywhere you send us we will go. We will obey you just as we obeyed Moses in everything. Certainly the Lord your God will be with you as he was with Moses. Anyone who rebels against your order and does not obey your words and all that you command him will be put to death. Above all, be strong and courageous. So this story, this narrative, Joshua, begins with God commissioning Joshua to lead the people. That's the first 4 verses. Perhaps most importantly, as we open this book, we find the Israelites in the middle of a transition of leadership. I told you we kind of find ourselves in the middle of the story, going back to the promise to Abraham that they're going to have this land. Well, they're looking now at the land. But we would have all expected Moses to be the one who leads them into it. But as we prepare to cross the Jordan into the land that God had given them, we begin with a funeral. And after Moses had died, Moses, the Lord's servant, and then the Lord spoke to Joshua, the son of Nun. Now, these 2 characters are not unknown to us. In fact, these are 2 of the towering figures in the Old Testament, and they sort of cross their paths here at the beginning of Joshua with the death of one and the need for the other to step up and become a leader. Let's start with Moses. Moses is a towering figure in Israelite history, going all the way back to his memorable birth. You remember in Exodus chapter 1, Moses is born to Jochebed and Amram, and he's in Egypt. And there's a decree of the male children in Egypt, Jewish children, should die, be killed. In fact, Pharaoh says to the midwives, every time one of these Jewish babies, male babies, is born, throw them into the Nile. And the midwives don't cooperate. And of course, it's one of the iconic stories of the Old Testament. His mother weans or nurses him for a while and then puts him in a little ark, a little papyrus basket, floats him down the Nile, where he's discovered by Pharaoh's daughter. And through a series of events, his mother gets to continue nursing him, and then he's raised in Pharaoh's household. He's being prepared to be the one who will lead the Israelites out of Egypt. He is a Jew in Egypt. And then in chapter 3, very quickly, he's all grown up, and God speaks to him in the wilderness from a burning bush. Another of the iconic moments in the Old Testament. And you remember, take off the shoes from your feet, and Moses is frightened, and don't be afraid. I am the Lord your God. And he commands him that he's going to be the one who leads them out of slavery in Egypt. And he does. He is the great liberator, the one who saves them from slavery in Egypt. And he leads them out with his staff. It's by his staff, of course, God ultimately, but his raised staff that the Red Sea parts. And 3 million Israelites cross through the sea on dry ground. And then it's by his staff, again, that the sea closes back over and destroys the army of Pharaoh. He leads them then to Mount Sinai, 3 months to Mount Sinai. He goes up on the mountain, receives the law, from Yahweh. But while he's doing it, while he's up there, they're melting down gold into a calf and worshiping it down in the valley. And God's not too pleased about that. This is the first sin. You shall have no other gods before you. And Moses is the one who pleads on their behalf. He intercedes for them, and God shows mercy to them. And then it's Moses who leads them in the wilderness for 40 years. And he's now brought them to this point where they are prepared to finally fulfill the promise made to Abraham. You can see the greatness of Moses in the 2 verses that precede Joshua. Just look at the end of Deuteronomy 34. Just canonically, these are the verses that set up Joshua 1:1 and after Moses died. Look at Deuteronomy 34:10. No prophet has arisen again in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. He was unparalleled for all the signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do against the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh, to all his officials, and to all his land, and for all the mighty acts of power and terrifying deeds that Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. Now that's quite a testimony about Israel's great leader, Moses. But there's something else you need to know about Moses. His whole life, his whole career points to the coming of someone else. We think about Moses as the great deliverer, the one who leads them up out of slavery, but his life points to a new Moses, someone who will come and lead his people not just out of slavery in Egypt, but out of a much more severe slavery, slavery to sin, slavery to ourselves, our own selfishness. A new Moses will be the great deliverer of the whole creation. And Moses' life points ahead to the coming of that one. Think about Moses' birth. I mean, we've just come out of the Christmas season. We didn't talk too much probably about Moses' birth, but we talked about Jesus' birth. But you'll recall when Jesus is born, there's a decree by a foreign oppressor that the male children, 2 years, Jewish children in Bethlehem, 2 years and younger, be executed. Sounds a lot like Moses. And where does Moses find refuge from that decree? In Egypt, in Pharaoh's household. Where do Mary and Joseph take Jesus to find refuge from the decree of Herod the Great? To Egypt. And they come out of Egypt, come into the land, actually the promised land, following the same track that Moses will travel. And then Jesus grows up, as you know, and the pattern develops where Moses goes through the Jordan River, he's baptized, and then what does he do? Immediately he goes into the wilderness. For how long? 40 days. Through the water, into the wilderness for 40 days, years. Sounds a lot like that story of the Israelites in the wilderness. And when Jesus is in the wilderness, he's tempted 3 times to turn stones to bread, to jump from the temple, shows him all the kingdoms of the world. Basically, the same 3 temptations that the Israelites experienced in the wilderness. And after every one of those temptations, a temptation to hunger, a temptation to worship other than Yahweh, the true God, Jesus answers with a passage from Deuteronomy that is part of the wilderness wandering passages. Deuteronomy 8:3, man did not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. That's what God said to the Israelites in the wilderness when they were grumbling and complaining about a lack of food. And when tempted to jump from the temple, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. Deuteronomy 6:13, or 6:13. Well, that's exactly what God said to the Israelites in the wilderness when they kept grumbling and complaining. And then you shall worship the Lord your God and Him only. That's what Jesus said in response to the temptation to bow down and worship me and I'll give you all the kingdoms. Well, yeah, that's what God said to them in the wilderness when they were tempted to worship golden calves. It's sort of a replaying. It's the same story, only now it's not only a new Moses, but a new and improved Moses. Moses led them out of slavery in Egypt, but Jesus leads the whole creation out of slavery to sin. He is the new and improved Moses. Well, then why didn't Moses lead them into the land? Well, there's this story in Numbers 20, where for the second time they're really grumbling and complaining about not having enough water. They're going to die of dehydration, And once God told Moses to strike the rock, and he did, and it gushed water for the people. But a second time, God told him to speak to the rock, and in Numbers 20, God struck it instead of speaking to it. And, for me, it doesn't sound like such a great transgression, but somehow that was rebellion against God. And God said, because you struck the rock when I told you to speak to it, you will not lead the people into the promised land. So it's not going to be him. Well, then who's going to do it? It's going to be Joshua. And that's where this story transitions from after the death of Moses, the Lord's servant, the Lord spoke to Joshua. So you know who Joshua is already if you know the first 5 books of the Old Testament. He's not a towering figure like Moses, but he's pretty well known if you just follow the story along. Joshua served as Moses' longtime servant from his youth, we learn in Numbers 11:28. So he's mentored by Moses from the time when he was young. When the Israelites are fighting the Amalekites after they've come up out of Egypt in Exodus chapter 17. They're fighting the Amalekites down in the valley. And you'll remember this battle because they would win when Moses held his arms up. And I think that's probably an image of prayer. And he noticed whenever he put his arms down, they started to lose. But when their arms were up, when his arms were up, they were winning. Well, his arms got tired. So his brother, Aaron, and Hur would hold his arms up so that they could win. But what you lose sight of is that it's Joshua leading the troops down in the valley. It's by Joshua's sword that they're actually defeating them with the cooperation of Moses holding up his arms in prayer. And of course, God is the one who ultimately fights for them. But you can see Joshua having his military training. And if they're going to take this land that God has given them, they're going to have to fight for it. The Canaanites aren't just going to surrender it to them. So he's mentored by Moses. He has military training. Moses actually took Joshua up on the mountain in the course of receiving the law. We find that in Exodus 24. Joshua is one of the 12 spies. When Moses chooses 12, one from every tribe to go in and scout out the land when they don't go in. Only 2 are named, Joshua and Caleb. And of course, they want to go in and take the land in obedience to God. But he has experience in the land. He's been there. He knows the challenges of it. The Lord informed Moses that he would not enter Canaan, the promised land, but Moses should encourage Joshua because he would lead them in. That's Deuteronomy 1:37 through 39. And finally, Moses publicly commissions Joshua as his successor in Numbers 27:17 through 19. Can you imagine any individual better prepared to take the reins of leadership after Moses than Joshua? But there's something else you need to know about Joshua. He points ahead to the coming of Jesus. Jesus is the thread that ties Old and New Testament together. The law and the prophets point to him and find their fulfillment in him. Moses points to Jesus. Jesus is the new and improved Moses. Well, so does Joshua. To begin, Jesus' name, Jesus, in Greek, Jesus, is the English pronunciation of the Hebrew name Yeshua, in the Old Testament, Joshua. Jesus and Joshua share the same name in Hebrew. And that name means the Lord is salvation. They're the same person. Now, not if you test their DNA, but they're the same person by name. The church father Origen argued that the book of Joshua does not so much indicate to us the deeds of the son of Nun, Joshua the son of Nun, but it represents for us the mysteries of Jesus the Lord. The Joshua we find in verse 1 looks ahead to the Jesus who conquers not with sword of bronze or chariot of fire, but with the word of God. Not over the Canaanite troops, but over our sins, the Canaanite within. Joshua will lead the Israelites into the promised rest of the promised land at a time and a place and a particular people. But Joshua is the one who will lead all of God's people into our promised rest in the ultimate promised land, which is our eternal home. Jesus is the new and improved Joshua. And so our book begins with the death of Moses and Yahweh's divine speech to Joshua, recapping the Moses situation after the death of Moses, and then introducing to us Joshua, who will lead them into the land. And then God comforted Joshua with his presence. So God commissions Joshua to lead the people into the land, verses 1 through 4, but he comforts Joshua with his presence in verses 5 through 9. Notice the verses that mark off this section. Look in verse 5. No one will be able to stand against you as long as you live. I will be with you just as I was with Moses. I will not leave you or abandon you. That's where this section begins. Now, look at verse 9. I've commanded you, be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid to discourage. But look how it ends. For the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. So verses 5 through 9 are marked off by the promise of God's presence. Now, nowhere in the text does the narrator indicate us that Joshua feels inadequate or that Joshua is trying to get out of being the one who leads them into the land. But we do hear the Lord offering Joshua encouragement. Do not be afraid, because I will be with you wherever you go. It's precisely what God had already spoken. He had told Joshua in Deuteronomy 31, verse 23, the Lord commissioned Joshua, son of Nun, be strong and courageous, for I will bring the Israelites into the land I swore to them, and I will be with you. He'd also earlier told Israel that he would be with them. In 31 verse 6, Deuteronomy 31, 6, be strong and courageous. Do not be terrified or afraid of them, for the Lord your God is the one who will go with you. He will not leave you or abandon you. God had promised his presence to Moses. He had promised his presence to the people, the Israelites. And now he promises his presence with Joshua. You'll also remember in Exodus chapter 3. You remember the burning bush? When God calls Moses, do you remember Moses? He's trying to get out of it. He's saying, I don't speak well. And why would the people listen to me? And why would Pharaoh listen to me? And who do I tell him sent me? And I just don't speak. I'm not very rhetorically skilled. And he's got excuses. He's trying to get out of it. And God promises him above everything else, I am Yahweh. That name means I am. But it's more than just a statement of God's existence. It means I am, but whenever God says I am, it's always followed by I am with you. As I was with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, as I was with your fathers, I will be with you. You remember Moses? I mean, the hesitant one, the find somebody else to do my job kind of guy. And God says, nope, I'll be with you. And of course, then he goes on to be their greatest leader. So God promises Joshua his presence. I'll be with you. The narrator never indicates that Joshua is fearful about doing what God is calling him to do. But he does tell us 3 times with increasing intensity that God says, be strong and courageous, do not be afraid, and do not be discouraged. Now, we might understand why Joshua would be fearful. I mean, he had some big sandals to fill. I don't know if you've ever had to follow a beloved person, a great person, but if you do, you can feel the pressure. That could create anxiety and fear that maybe you can't live up to the legend. I mean, IBC had a pastor here for 18 years who did a remarkable job, who was a phenomenal leader and preacher. And you know, you get a young guy come along to follow him. You don't think there's some reason to maybe have some anxiety and fear? Now, thanks be to God that Jeff has led so well and God has clearly been with him. But can you imagine feeling some of that fear and anxiety about trying to follow someone like that? I mean, we see it in all areas of society. I mean, Bob Stoops had a pretty good run at OU. It's been a little bit of a struggle since his retirement. Now, if you're an OSU fan, you take great joy in that. But if you say Boomer, it's been tough. Brent Venables probably feels a lot of pressure in that job. Well, I can't imagine anybody having bigger sandals to fill than Joshua had in following the great Moses. And can you imagine how the people feel with Moses dying before they are able to go into the land? And although the text doesn't say Joshua is afraid or fearful, we can infer maybe through the 3 times, do not be afraid, do not be discouraged, be strong and courageous, that maybe fear could be lurking. And just the pressure of the job. They've been waiting for more than 400 years to enter into this land. And now they can see it. You know, it's just across this river that's overflowing its banks. But there's giants in that land. And I imagine Joshua is feeling the pressure. So he had big sandals to fill. He had a challenging people to lead. Can you imagine trying to lead these Israelites? They grumbled against Moses almost immediately, having brought them out of slavery in Egypt. What'd you bring us out here to die? Well, we could have just died in Egypt. Wouldn't it have been better to just stay back there and avoided all this trouble? They grumble and complain because they don't have food. They grumble and complain because they don't have water. Whenever Moses goes up on the mountain, they're like, where'd he go? Who's going to lead us now? If I had to lead these people, I'd be fearful. The text doesn't say it. The name Israel means striving with God. They often do that. And then there were giant obstacles to overcome in the land. I mean, this land is filled with people who are prepared to fight. We find out in Numbers 13 when they send the spies into the land, they come back and they say, man, they're giants and they're fighting men. We can't do it. We can't take it. From personal experience, Joshua has been in that land. He's seen the giants in the land. He knew they were skilled warriors who lived in strong, fortified cities. He knew their frequent fighting had them well conditioned for battle. And for the most part, the terrain was mountainous, a fact that would make military maneuvers difficult. Joshua needed strength. He needed courage. And thanks be to God that when the Lord calls, He provides what we need. And what he needed was to know that the Lord was with him. And if God was with him, he could be strong and courageous. And then Joshua commanded the leaders to prepare in verses 10 and 11. There's really nothing to say here except he says, get everybody ready because in 3 days we're crossing the Jordan. 3 days. They've waited 400 plus years. Many of these people wandered in the wilderness for 40 years waiting to enter into this land. Tell the people and get them ready in 3 days. We're crossing this river. that is, to take the land. And then finally, Joshua charged the eastern tribes to fight for unity. When you read these verses 12 through 18, you can get a little disoriented here. Who are the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh? Well, you know there are 12 tribes. And Moses had defeated two kings, Sihon and Og. You can read about this in Numbers 21. They were two Amorite kings. They weren't kings who lived in the Promised Land. They lived just on the eastern side of the Jordan River. Moses had led the people to victory over those two kings, Sihon and Og. And he took their territory, their land. And these 2.5 tribes, Reuben was one of the sons of Jacob, so the Reubenites. Gad was one of the sons of Jacob, the Gadites. And a half-tribe of Manasseh, two of Joseph's children, Ephraim and Manasseh, are two of the tribes. And one of those tribes, a son of Joseph, Manasseh, half that tribe. So the Reubenites, the Gadites, and half the tribe of Manasseh. Boy, isn't this exhilarating? Receive the land on the eastern portion of the Jordan River. So they already have their land, and their enemies were already defeated. But that's not technically the promised land. And so Joshua says to them in 12 through 18, he speaks just to them, not to the rest of the tribes, but to them. You will not be able to enjoy your rest, that is, rest in your land, until your brothers, the other tribes, have taken possession of their land. And so, even though you already have yours and you could just settle down in your safety and security, you're going to have to go with them into the Promised Land, cross the Jordan, and fight with them so that they could have their rest. It's about unity. If these people are going to make it as a nation, they're going to have to be unified. And to be unified, they're going to have to fight together to possess the land. And they say, we will. No worries. We will. And they will. And by the end of our study on Wednesday night, we'll see they have taken largely possession of that land. And we'll hear this phrase again, that they have taken possession of their rest, the promised rest. Peace in the land with all of God's promises. That's what we're all after. Since Adam and Eve sinned and were banished from the Garden of Eden, all humanity has been seeking that rest. Israel sought it in a land that God had promised them. We're all seeking it today. The promised rest in the promised land. And Joshua won't lead us there, but the new Joshua will. The one whose name means the Lord is salvation. He is my and your only hope. Believe in Him. Trust in Him. And He will be with you. Let's pray.